2,500 years have passed, yet one name still echoes across time, a symbol of power, ambition, and conquest. That name is Alexander the Great, a conqueror who reshaped the map of the known world within a single lifetime. By the age of 20, he claimed the throne of Macedonia. Within a decade, Greece, Egypt, Persia, and the gates of India had fallen under his shadow. In an era of slow communication, incomplete maps, and months of travel, Alexander built the greatest empire history had ever witnessed. He blended Greek philosophy, Persian administration, and Eastern traditions into something the world had never seen before. So how did he do it? Was he truly great, or simply an ambitious young king who conquered the world, but could never conquer himself? This is his complete story. Pause 2 seconds before starting the next part. Allow background music to breathe between lines. Alexander was born in 356 BC in Pella, the ancient capital of Macedonia. His father was Philip II, a brilliant military reformer who transformed Macedonia from a minor kingdom into a dominant Greek power. His mother, Olympias, was a fierce, deeply religious woman who claimed descent from Achilles. From birth, Alexander was told he was destined for greatness.
When Alexander was 13 years old, his education reached an entirely different level. King Philip hired the greatest philosopher in history to be his son's personal teacher, Aristotle of Stagira. At a beautiful sanctuary called the Garden of the Nymphs at Mysa, Aristotle gave Alexander daily lessons in medicine, philosophy, science, religion, and politics. The boys who studied alongside him, Ptolemy, Hephaestion, Cassander, would later become history's most powerful men. Aristotle gave Alexander a personal annotated copy of the Iliad. Alexander would carry it for the rest of his life, sleeping with it under his pillow alongside his dagger. The philosopher and the conqueror remained in correspondence even after Alexander left Macedonia forever. In gratitude, Philip rebuilt Aristotle's destroyed hometown of Stagira and freed all its enslaved people. It was a gesture that showed how seriously he took his son's education, and perhaps how much he feared what would happen if that education was interrupted. When Alexander was just 10 years old, a horse trader arrived at the Macedonian court with a magnificent black stallion. He was asking 13 talents for the animal, an extraordinary sum. But no one could ride it. The horse reared and threw every rider who attempted to mount. Philip was about to send the trader away when young Alexander stepped forward. "I can ride him." His father looked at him. He was amused, curious. He made a bet. If Alexander could ride the horse, he would pay the full price. If he failed, the boy would pay it himself. Alexander had noticed something no one else had. The horse was frightened of its own shadow. He turned the animal to face the sun, removing the shadow from its view, then mounted smoothly while speaking softly to the horse. Bucephalus, meaning ox head, became his forever. Philip was said to weep with joy. He told his son, "Macedonia is too small for you, my boy. You must look to a greater kingdom." It was a prophecy that would reshape the world. At 16, while Philip was
2 years later, at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, Philip gave Alexander command of the companion cavalry, the elite heavy cavalry that would become the decisive weapon of the Macedonian military system. Alexander personally destroyed the sacred band of Thebes, an elite unit of 300 soldiers who had never been defeated. Every single one died on that field. But victory on the battlefield could not prevent crisis at home. Philip married a new wife, Cleopatra Eurydice, a Macedonian noblewoman, not a foreigner like Olympias. Her uncle drunkenly toasted the hope for a legitimate heir. Alexander threw his wine cup at the man. Philip drew his sword. He slipped and fell, drunk before he could use it. Alexander walked out, taking his mother into exile. The reconciliation between father and son came, but the wound never fully healed. In 336 BC, at a great royal celebration, King Philip II was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards, stabbed in the theater at a guy. Alexander was 20 years old. He was now king of Macedonia. The new king moved with lightning speed. Rivals were eliminated. The Greek states that had celebrated Philip's death, expecting freedom, now stared at Alexander's army outside their gates. He called a congress. He was appointed supreme commander of a planned war against Persia, the same war his father had dreamed of. In 335 BC, when Thebes revolted,
The message was received across Greece. No one else rebelled. In spring 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont Strait from Europe into Asia with an army of approximately 37,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. He threw a spear into the Asian shore as his feet touched the ground, claiming Asia as his by conquest. His first act in Asia was to visit Troy, the ancient city of Achilles. He ran naked around the hero's tomb, placed a garland there, and declared himself the new Achilles. The siege of the world's greatest empire had begun with an act of poetry. The first test came quickly. The Persian satraps of Western Asia assembled a cavalry force and positioned it on the eastern bank of the Granicus River, a tactically strong defensive position. Alexander's generals advised caution. He attacked at once. The Battle of the Granicus River was more than a battle. It was a statement. Alexander led the cavalry charge personally, riding directly toward the Persian commanders. He was nearly killed. A Persian nobleman struck his helmet with an axe, splitting it, but not his skull. General Clytus the Black cut the Persian's arm off at the last second, saving Alexander's life. The Persians broke. Alexander captured the coastal Greek cities one by one. He dissolved their oligarchic governments and installed democracies, positioning himself as liberator, not conqueror. At Gordium, winter quarters in 333 BC,
In autumn 333 BC, Alexander finally came face to face with the Persian king himself, Darius III. The two armies met at Issus on the narrow coastal plain of modern Turkey. Darius commanded perhaps 100,000 men to Alexander's 37,000, but numbers on that narrow ground meant nothing. Alexander personally led the companion cavalry in a wedge directly toward Darius on his royal chariot. The Persian king watched this young man in bronze armor cutting through his guards like a sword through silk and made a decision that history would never forgive. He turned his chariot and fled. The entire Persian army collapsed when their king abandoned the field. In his flight, Darius left behind his mother, his wife, his daughters, and his entire royal treasury. When Alexander visited the Persian royal women in their tent, Darius's mother Sisygambis prostrated before Hephaestion by mistake, thinking he was the king. "You were not mistaken, mother," Alexander told her. "He too is Alexander." It was a gesture of extraordinary generosity. Darius sent letters offering Alexander half his empire in exchange for peace. "If I were Alexander, I would accept that," said Parmenion, his senior general. "So would I," said Alexander, "if I were Parmenion." The war continued. Rather than chase Darius east, Alexander moved south. He had to secure the Mediterranean coast before going further. The sea
Gaza offered resistance too and suffered for it. Then came Egypt. The Persian governor surrendered without a fight. The Egyptians welcomed Alexander as a liberator from hated Persian rule. He visited the great temples, made sacrifices to Egyptian gods, and was proclaimed Pharaoh, the divine ruler of Egypt. In late winter 331 BC, Alexander undertook an extraordinary journey through the Sahara Desert to consult the oracle of Ammon at the Siwa oasis. What the oracle told him was never revealed, but Alexander returned calling himself the son of Zeus Ammon. The divine claim would complicate the rest of his reign, but it also gave him an authority no ordinary king possessed. Before leaving Egypt, he marked out the boundaries of a new city on the Mediterranean coast, Alexandria. He would never return to see it built, but Alexandria would become the greatest city in the world, home to the famous library, the lighthouse pharaohs, and the center of Hellenistic civilization for centuries. In autumn 331 BC, the world held its breath. Darius had assembled the largest army in history. Estimates range from 100,000 to 200,000 warriors, including the elite Persian immortals, war elephants, scythe chariots, and cavalry from across his empire. He had also specially leveled the plain at Gaugamela in Mesopotamia to give his chariots maximum advantage.
When Darius was finally hunted down by Alexander's cavalry, they found him dying, abandoned, and stabbed by his own satrap Bessus, who had hoped to use the king as a bargaining chip. Alexander reportedly covered the dying king with his own cloak. He gave Darius a Persian royal funeral. He executed Bessus for treason. He was not merely a conqueror. He was already behaving as the rightful Persian king. The night before the battle, Parmenion suggested a night attack. Alexander refused. "I will not steal my victory," he said. He slept so soundly that his generals had to wake him in the morning. Whether it was supreme confidence or supreme exhaustion from planning, history does not say.
The battle began with Persian scythed chariots charging the Macedonian lines. Alexander had prepared. His soldiers stepped aside and let the chariots through, stabbing the horses from the sides as they passed harmlessly. Then came the decisive moment. Alexander spotted a gap in the Persian line and led the companion cavalry in a direct charge toward it, aiming straight at Darius. For the second time, Darius turned and fled before Alexander's charge. His army, seeing their king flee, collapsed. The battle was over before the sun had moved far across the sky. Darius was now a fugitive. Alexander was the new master of the Persian Empire. At 25 years old, he had just conquered the greatest empire the world had ever known. Alexander entered Babylon to cheering crowds, and then Susa, where he found treasury rooms containing gold and silver worth what would today be hundreds of billions of dollars, accumulated tribute from centuries of Persian Empire. He sent 6,000 mules and 5,000 camels just to carry the treasure from Susa. At Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia, he found the palace complex that represented everything the Greeks had feared and hated about Persia. After months of celebrations, Persepolis burned. Ancient sources debate whether it was deliberate revenge, encouraged by the Athenian courtesan Thais, or an accident fueled by wine and triumph. The ruins of Persepolis still stand in modern Iran.
At a drunken dinner, an argument broke out. Cletus the Black, the man who had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus, made cutting remarks about Alexander's divine pretensions and his dismissal of Philip's achievements. Alexander seized a spear and killed him on the spot. He wept for 3 days afterward in his tent, refusing food. It was the darkest moment of his life. And then, love. At the Sogdian rock fortress, a seemingly impregnable mountain, his soldiers climbed ice cliffs at night to capture it. Among the prisoners was a nobleman's daughter named Roxana. Alexander fell in love with her and married her, not as a political alliance, but uniquely for love. It was the only marriage of his own choice. In 327 BC, Alexander crossed the Khyber Pass into India. The Greek world ended here. This was the true edge of the known world, and no Greek army had ever crossed it. Alexander was about to enter a continent of 50 million people, monsoon rains, jungle, and war elephants. The city of Taxila in northern Punjab welcomed him. Its king, Taxiles, became an ally. But further west, on the banks of the Hydaspes River, waited King Porus of the Pauravas, described by ancient sources as over 6 feet 5 inches tall, a warrior of extraordinary courage, commanding an army of 30,000 soldiers and 200 war elephants. The Hydaspes River was flooded by monsoon rains. Porus waited on the far bank. Alexander deceived him with weeks of fake crossing attempts, then found a spot upstream during a violent thunderstorm and crossed undetected with half his force, turning Porus's flank. The Battle of the Hydaspes was Alexander's hardest battle. The war elephants terrified the horses. Soldiers had to fight the massive animals at close range, hacking at their legs and trunks. But Alexander's tactical genius prevailed once more. Porus was wounded in 9 places. Still, he refused to flee. He fought until his elephant finally knelt. When Alexander finally met Porus face to face and asked how he wished to be treated, the captured Indian king answered simply, as a king. Alexander returned him his kingdom and gave him more land besides. He had found an enemy worthy of his respect, perhaps the last one he would ever find. He founded 2 cities on either side of the Hydaspes. One he named Nicaea, victory. The other he named Bucephalus, after his horse, who died. The return was nearly as costly as the conquest. Alexander divided his forces. His admiral Nearchus sailed the fleet through uncharted Indian Ocean waters toward Persia. Alexander himself led the main army through the Gedrosian Desert, modern Balochistan and Pakistan. The Gedrosian Desert nearly destroyed everything the campaign had achieved. Tens of thousands of soldiers, camp followers, women, and children died of thirst, heat, and starvation. Flash floods swept away camps at night. Ancient sources say more were lost in the desert than in all battles combined. Of 85,000 who entered the desert, perhaps 15,000 emerged. One story defines this passage. When soldiers found a small amount of water in a dry riverbed and brought it to Alexander in a helmet, he tipped it into the sand without drinking. While his men went without water, he refused to drink.
The army, watching this, reportedly felt more inspired than if he had given each man a bucket. He emerged from the desert, reunited with Nearchus's fleet, and turned to rebuilding his empire. Mass weddings at Susa married his officers to Persian noblewomen. He paid off all his soldiers' debts. He integrated Persian soldiers into Macedonian units. And when his veterans mutinied at Opis, outraged at being replaced, he shamed them with a speech so powerful that they wept, reconciled, and feasted together that night. Then came the blow that no campaign could prepare him for. In October 324 BC, Alexander's closest companion since childhood, Hephaestion, died in Ecbatana of fever. They had been inseparable since boyhood. Some historians believe they were lovers. All agree they were the deepest friendship of Alexander's life. Alexander's grief was catastrophic. He lay over the body for a day and night. He ordered the sacred flame of Persia extinguished, a gesture of mourning usually reserved for dead kings. He launched a brutal winter war against a local tribe, seemingly to have something to fight. He ordered a funeral monument costing 10,000 talents, the equivalent of 15 years of Macedonian royal income. Ambassadors from across the world were now arriving in Babylon. From Libya, from Carthage, from Italy, from the Scythian steppes, all acknowledged the ruler of the world. Alexander was planning his next campaign: Arabia, then Carthage, then Rome. In late May 323 BC, at a party hosted by his admiral Medius in Babylon, Alexander drank heavily through the night. The next morning, he felt feverish. The fever did not break. For 11 days, his doctors attempted treatments, bleeding, medicine, cold baths. He grew steadily weaker. On June 10th or 11th, 323 BC, Alexander the Great died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. He was 32 years old. The cause of Alexander's death has been debated for 2,500 years. Ancient sources offer multiple explanations. He drank a large cup of wine and immediately cried out in pain, suggesting possible poisoning. The most accused in ancient sources was Antipater's family, who had political reasons to want Alexander dead. Modern medical analysis suggests typhoid fever complicated by bowel perforation, consistent with symptoms described. The bacteria would have spread from the polluted Euphrates River. Some researchers have suggested Veratrum album, white hellebore, a plant whose symptoms match the ancient descriptions closely. We still do not know. There is one final mystery. When his generals gathered at his deathbed and asked who should inherit his empire, Alexander is reported to have said, "to the strongest," or perhaps said nothing at all. His body reportedly showed no signs of decomposition for 6 days after death. Ancient sources recorded this as miraculous. Modern medicine suggests catalepsy. He may have been in a coma, not yet dead. Whether the body was carried to Alexandria and buried there, or whether his tomb was lost, is unknown. Roman emperors Julius Caesar and Augustus both visited what they believed to be his tomb in Alexandria. Today, his tomb has never been found. Alexander died without naming a successor. His generals, the Diadochi, the successors, tore his empire apart in wars that lasted 40 years. His wife Roxana was murdered. His son Alexander IV, born after his death, was killed as a teenager before he could reign. His mother Olympias was executed. One by one, everyone who had been closest to him died violently. But what Alexander had created could not be killed. The Hellenistic world that emerged from his conquests lasted 3 centuries. The Library of Alexandria preserved and synthesized the knowledge of all ancient civilizations. The Greek language became the common tongue from Egypt to Afghanistan. The Buddhist art of Gandhara still shows Greek faces. The city of Kandahar still bears in its name the echo of Alexander. He founded somewhere between 70 and 100 cities. He opened trade routes that eventually connected Rome to India and China. The Silk Road became possible, in part because of the political landscape he created. The encounter between Greek science and Eastern mathematics produced advances that shaped the Renaissance 2,000 years later. Every civilization that came after him, Roman, Byzantine, Arab, Persian, medieval European, Mughal Indian, carried some fragment of what Alexander set in motion. Napoleon studied his campaigns. Julius Caesar wept at his tomb. Genghis Khan followed his logistical model. Today, his name in some form, Iskander, Sikander, Alexander, is still given to children from Albania to Pakistan. The question must be asked. Alexander burned Persepolis. He massacred the defenders of Tyre and Gaza. He killed his friend Clytus in drunken rage. He demanded to be worshipped as divine, alienating the companions who loved him. He led tens of thousands of men to die in deserts and mountains they had never asked to cross. And yet, he never lost a battle. He personally led every charge, took every risk he asked his soldiers to take, and bled alongside them in the front lines. He forgave his enemies and honored them. He was genuinely curious about the world. He brought scientists and philosophers on his campaigns, cataloging plants, animals, and peoples across 3 continents. He dreamed not just of conquest, but of a world where Greeks and Persians, East and West, might become one civilization.
Perhaps the most honest verdict is this. He was a human being of extraordinary gifts, courage, intelligence, vision, charisma, who also carried within him extraordinary flaws. The pride of a demigod, the rage of a man who could not accept limits, the loneliness of someone who could conquer the world, but could not stop. He died at 32, in a foreign city, thousands of miles from home, with an empire in his hands and no heir to hold it. The fire that he was could not burn forever, but 2,500 years later, we are still warmed by it. The ruins of Persepolis still stand in Iran. In Afghanistan, archaeologists have uncovered Greek temples and theaters. In Pakistan, Buddhist statues were the face of Apollo. In Egypt, a city still carries his name. In Greece, his statue stands on the waterfront of Thessaloniki, sword raised, looking east. He was not the greatest human being in history, but he may have been the most consequential. No single person, before or since, changed so much of the world in so short a time. Alexander, son of Philip, son of Zeus Ammon, student of Aristotle, writer of Bucephalus, conqueror of Persia, pharaoh of Egypt, king of kings, the man who wept because there were no more worlds to conquer.